Good evening, everyone. Hello, hello. It's good to see all of you. Though I am often confused for being Nathan, I am not him. People often come up to me on the street and they're like, aren't you that guy that just wins bike races on accident? Aren't you that guy that's just always running up mountains? Aren't you that guy that just adopts and fosters every kid that there is? And I just let them believe that I'm Nathan. But I'm not Nathan. My name is Phil. I am the pastor of one of our other parishes, the Sacred Grace TNL. We meet here on Tuesday nights. And I just want to say that I'm so happy to be here. I'm excited. I get excited every time I get a chance to be with you all. You're always so welcoming, so thank you. Last time I spoke was during our Jonah series, and I made a joke that if something I said bothered you, to email nathan@thesacredgrace.org. And I still stand by that, but I wanted to make sure that I said that we are one church. There are multiple parishes, but we are one church. And so if there's ever anything that I say that you want to talk more about or you just vehemently disagree about, or anything, really, I want you to know that you have an open invitation to come talk to me. I'm not saying don't talk to Nathan, because I talk to Nathan about pretty much everything that's going on in my life. But please know that I am always available to you. I am not your primary pastor, but I consider myself still your pastor. You don't have to consider me that way. That's fine. But I just wanted to make sure that we all are on the same page there. My door is always open to any of you. Tonight we're continuing in our final week of this generosity series. We believe that we're created to reflect God's love to the world. And one of the best ways for us to do that is by being generous people. So every year, throughout the month of November, we spend 4 weeks reflecting on the meaning and character of generosity for our family of churches. And this year, we're digging into ways of living that promote generosity. So we believe that we can grow in generosity through living gratefully, living simply, and living justly. And tonight, we're talking about how we can live justly. Living justly means living according to what is right or what is fair, living fairly. And at least that's what I thought that I was going to be talking about tonight. That's what Nathan, Joe, and I planned that this week was going to be about. But the conclusion that I came to while putting this talk together is that instead, God actually asks us to be people who live unjustly. Now, what do I mean by live unjustly? Some of you are like, now I know why he said, if I have a problem, email Nathan. Do I mean live unfairly? What is this business about spreading unfairness around? That sounds like the opposite of generosity. That sounds like you are talking about the opposite of what we normally talk about. And at least on the surface, I think it certainly does. But it's how God lives towards us and calls us to live toward each other. And it's, I think, one of the most generous things we can do. Because generosity isn't about what's fair, right? Generosity isn't concerned with what's fair. It transcends what's fair. And in that way, generosity is unfair in the best way. I know that when you hear unfair, you think immediately something negative, and that obviously you should. But that's not the way that we're going to be talking about it tonight. We can become more generous people by living unjustly, by spreading the unfairness around that we've received to others. And in doing so, we stay connected to our stories, the things that have taken place in our lives. Staying connected to our stories keeps us aware of the generosity that we've been shown. And when we stay aware of the generosity that we've been shown, it inspires us to extend generosity to others, especially those in need. To show you what I mean, tonight we're going to be looking at a passage from the Old Testament, from the book of Deuteronomy, which is the 5th book of the Bible, all the way up in the front. To understand what we're going to be reading, though, we need some context. Usually, at the end of a president's term, they give this one last speech. It's sort of a presidential farewell speech. It's usually in the last month of their term, and it's broadcast everywhere. It's on the radio, it's on the TV. It's really hard to avoid. And Deuteronomy, especially the latter half of the book, is basically a presidential farewell address. It is Moses' last speech to the people of Israel before he dies. At this point, the people of Israel have been freed from slavery from Egypt. You probably all have heard that story. Moses parts the Red Sea, everyone crosses through it, and then Pharaoh comes after him. The Red Sea doesn't stay parted. There's probably a better way to describe that. And it floods, and Pharaoh gets angry and the Israels are free. That is a terrible synopsis of the story. But at this point, Israel has been freed from slavery from Egypt. And they've been wandering around the desert for almost 40 years. And they've been waiting for the land that God promised them that they would settle in and that they would prosper in. So Moses is addressing, in this passage that we're about to read, he's addressing this ragged group of former slaves who have now been nomads for years, essentially on his deathbed. So this is Deuteronomy 24, verses 19 through 21. And Moses says this, "When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your work, in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner and the fatherless and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner and the fatherless and the widow." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, what is going on here? Why on earth is Moses telling these people that have been wandering around the desert for decades, people who don't have fields and don't have trees and don't have vineyards, that don't have any land of their own except for sand that they're walking on, why is he talking to them about what they should do with crops that they don't have? And on top of that, this really doesn't seem fair. These people have wandered around the desert for years and years and years. And Moses is saying they're going to finally have land. They'll finally have crops. Land that they've wandered and waited around years for. Crops that they have worked hard to cultivate. Crops that will be their livelihood. And they're supposed to intentionally not be as efficient as possible. They're supposed to intentionally only go over their fields and their trees and their vineyards once when harvesting. These people who have been living in scarcity for years are supposed to suddenly not get as much of their yield as possible. Also, people who haven't done any of the work can reap the benefit. That's not fair. Who are these people that reap the benefit? Who are the foreigner and the fatherless and the widow in Hebrew society? These are people who would have no means of caring for themselves. These are people who didn't have many or often any rights at all. They couldn't own land. They couldn't grow their own food. They were the neediest of Israel's society. It's interesting to me to think about how similar attitudes are today about the neediest in our society. There's certainly a lot of goodness and a lot of charity and generosity in our society that should be celebrated. But there are also large swaths of the population that still look down on people who are downtrodden. We assume that it's their fault that they're needy. They must have made poor choices to find themselves in this position. So why should I give my time or my money or my possessions to people who are too lazy to put the work in for themselves? Why should I enable addicts? Why should I put my money towards people who are just going to take advantage of my goodwill? None of that is very just. None of that is very fair. People thousands of years ago had these same thoughts. But thankfully, Moses isn't done with what he's saying. Moses gives all these commands about people leaving part of their harvest behind for the foreigner and the fatherless and the widow. And then he concludes with this in verse 22. "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this." Why should your work benefit people who have done nothing to deserve it? Why should you intentionally do things to care for those who can't care for themselves? Why should you engage in these practices that really aren't fair to you at all? Because you used to be slaves in Egypt. That's why. Because you, and for hundreds of years before you, your ancestors were slaves. And then someone did something about that. And there's risk in forgetting that. There's danger in you forgetting Egypt, forgetting slavery, forgetting the injustice you faced, and therefore also forgetting how God rescued you and freed you and continues to care for you. Yes, what you're being asked to do is not fair to you at all. But guess what? Rescue isn't fair. Redemption isn't fair. Salvation isn't fair. Grace isn't fair. Generosity isn't fair. God isn't fair. God is so much better than fair to us. So living unjustly with a concern for the weak and the oppressed and the needy and the suffering reminds us of the gifts that we've been given in our lives, most of which, if not all, we don't deserve. Gifts that aren't fair because God isn't fair. He is prodigal. He is wildly extravagant in the gifts that he gives us, which are meant to be spread on, to be shared, to be passed on to people around us, not to just be hoarded for ourselves. So this passage is saying to these people who have come out of oppression, someday soon your oppression will be a distant memory. Someday soon you'll be stable and you'll be comfortable and you'll be successful. Don't let your stability and your comfort and your success make you indifferent to the needs of others. Don't let your safety make you indifferent to people who are always in danger. Don't let your freedom harden your heart to people who aren't free. Don't let your heart be hardened towards people who are suffering just like you once suffered. Remember the gifts that God showers on you, not because you deserved them, but because he loves you. Remember the very tangible unfairness that you've been shown by being free. You are not in Egypt. You are in your own land, on your own land, harvesting your own crops. A lot had to happen for you to not still be a slave in Egypt. Remember the unfairness that God has extended to you and extend that unfairness to others. Live unjustly, live generously. Now, it seems that if we don't stay in touch with our own stories, our own history, if we forget how we once suffered, we become people with really hard hearts. We become people with hard hearts who ignore the suffering of others. We quickly become indifferent and cold and cynical and ungrateful and selfish. A lot of things that don't go hand in hand with being generous. John talks about this very thing in his first letter, aptly titled 1 John in the Bible. There he says in 1 John 3, verse 17, suppose a believer who is rich enough to have all the necessities of life sees a fellow believer who is poor and does not have even basic needs. What if the rich believer does not help the poor one? Then it is clear that God's love is not in that person's heart. It is clear that that person is not reflecting the love of God to the world around them. Eugene Peterson, who translated the Bible into the Message, puts more teeth and point on this verse from the Message version, which reads, if you see some brother or sister in need and have the means to do something about it, but turn a cold shoulder and do nothing, what happens to God's love? It disappears, and you made it disappear. I love and hate that verse because it just punches me in the gut every time. If you have the ability to extend grace, to reflect God's love, to be generous, to spread the unfairness around, and you choose not to, then not only are you refusing to acknowledge the grace and the unfairness that you've been shown, and the love of God is not in you. And not only that, but you are actively working against the love of God. And you will grow cold and indifferent and selfish and angry and lonely and unfulfilled and certainly not generous. This is why Jesus and the writers of the New Testament talk so much about serving, I think. I don't think it's to put heavy, burdensome obligations on us. I think the emphasis on serving is, at least in part, to keep you connected to your story, to remind you of what you've been given and the grace that you've been shown in your life, to inspire you to extend what you've been given on to others. So what unfairness is in your story? What gifts, what rescue, what redemption, what grace is in your history? Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. So what is your Egypt? Where is there liberation from slavery in your life? How have you suffered, and how have you been delivered? Maybe you can't think of an example right now. Maybe you're yet to experience it. Or maybe, probably, it's less dramatic than liberation from literal slavery. But that doesn't make it any less, that doesn't make what you've experienced any less important or formative. My story is far less dramatic than freedom from literal slavery, but I have certainly experienced a form of metaphorical slavery through literal addiction. I found myself in a place where I literally didn't have control over myself anymore, in a place where I had given my freedom away to a darkness that took everything from me. And I also have been given freedom from that addiction that I did not and do not deserve. I don't deserve recovery. I've hurt so many people in my life. I've done so many terrible things that I don't deserve forgiveness for, but I still receive forgiveness for. And that's not fair. And I'm really thankful for it. When I don't stay close to that story, when I let myself forget the unfairness that I've so graciously been shown, I quickly become very indifferent to suffering that is right in front of me. I become hard-hearted and cynical and cold. And in the biggest twist of my life, the thing that once brought only darkness and death and destruction and pain is now a gift to help me remember that I am loved, to help me stay in the light, and to help me remember to love others. So living unjustly, living with intention towards addressing some suffering, staying connected to those who are suffering, prevents me from forgetting how I've suffered. And more importantly, it prevents me from forgetting how that suffering has just so unfairly been turned from death to joy in my life. And that ignites gratitude in me. It ignites an awareness of what God has done in my life, the generosity that he has shown me, which pushes me towards generosity for others, especially the neediest. It pushes me and drives me to spread the unfairness that I've so graciously been given to everyone around me. We say every week in our generosity prayer, we choose to be generous because our Father is generous, and as his daughters and sons, we want to show the world what he is like. In order to show the world what he is like, we have to remember the generosity, the unfairness that God has extended to us in our lives and in our suffering, and then pass that grace on to others who are suffering. Don't let your stability, don't let your comfort, don't let your success make you indifferent. Don't let your freedom erase the memory of Egypt, the memory of how you've suffered and the grace that you found there. Because that memory of that grace stokes the fire of the love of God inside of you, the very love that you were created to reflect out to the world. So to conclude, I just have a few questions for you to think through. What part of your story do you need to remember? And what gratitude does that memory ignite in you? That might be a hard thing to answer. And if nothing else, maybe the gratitude that you feel for remembering a way that you suffered is simply that you are not there anymore. How can that memory drive you to live more unjustly? And how might God be asking you to be more generous with all your resources, your relationships, your time, your money, your possessions, etc., etc., etc.? Live unjustly and live generously. We can all become more generous people by living unjustly, by spreading the unfairness and the grace and the generosity that we've received, by living with intention and concern for meeting the needs of the most vulnerable in our lives. In doing so, we stay connected to our stories, which keeps us aware of the generosity that we've been shown, which inspires us to extend generosity to those in need. So to conclude tonight, to conclude this series, if you're willing and able, would you please stand and pray with me our generosity prayer? All that we have, we bring God. We bring nothing into this world, and we take nothing out of it. We choose to follow the way of Jesus and increase in generosity until it can be said, there is no one in need among us. We choose to be faithful stewards of all our resources, relationships, time, possessions, and money. We choose to be generous because our Father is generous, and as his daughters and sons, we want to show the world what he is like. Amen.